This is the Free Spirits of L&D podcast, where we talk about life as a freelancer in the fascinating world of learning and development, and ask our guests all the questions you wanted to know but were maybe too afraid to ask. Yes, we even talk about how we get business and what we all charge. At the end of each episode, each guest gets to set a bonus question for the next one. So whether you're thinking about taking the leap, brand new to freelancing, or an experienced freelancer, you won't want to miss this. In this episode, our special guest is Paul Matthews. Paul is a CEO, author, speaker, and L&D strategist. Originally hailing from New Zealand, now based in the UK, Paul has spent over 20 years in the L&D space, and we're really looking forward to diving into all of that experience today. Welcome, Paul.
To be here. And actually, it's 25 years, strangely enough.
25 years. Excellent.
No, the 25th anniversary was June 2020. Last year.
And I know before you got into L&D, you had quite an unusual sort of trajectory towards that space. So I wanted just to start with a bit of a question about your origin story as a freelancer in L&D. What was that like?
Sounds like a Marvel comic, doesn't it? The origin story. The superhero. No, I do not have a billowing cape and shiny underpants. But anyways, it was accident, I think, like many of these things. I was actually in a senior role, a director's role in a NASDAQ quoted multinational IT company. So I was doing the big ticket stuff. And the company I was with got sold, and I didn't like the new owners, and they had me slated for the corner office. And I said, I just don't want to do that. So I left. It was a horrible time, actually, in hindsight, because they made me do all the redundancies during my 3 months before I had to leave. So I was the one that had to wield the axe and so on. But anyway, so I went solo at that point, and that was in the middle of 99. And so that's really what got me going solo, was I left a place where I didn't want to be anymore. So it wasn't so much going towards something as it was really about going away from something. And at that point, I did look for another permanent job, but it wasn't so easy back then, and started doing consultancy, bits and pieces, tried lots of different stuff, actually. Some of it worked, most of it didn't.
What sort of things did you try?
The role I'd had in the big company was sales director for Europe, amongst other things, but it was an IT tech company. So I had quite a lot of contacts. So I did some work in consultancy, helping people procure IT systems, and also helping bid, to sell IT systems. So it was that kind of stuff I got involved with. And actually, strangely enough, the path into L&D, I ended up attending a management course, 4 days in a classroom in the old style with the overhead projector, acetates and all of that. And the reason I did that is I actually had a free one, because when I had been in that previous company, one of our suppliers for training had screwed up, and they offered me a free course. And I came back after and said, well, I've still got this free course in my pocket. So I didn't tell him I'd left the company. I just said, I want that free course and I'm going to do it. So I joined and did this course. And on the second day, the guy that running it said, what are you doing here? You should be running it. You should be teaching it. So I said, well, that's an interesting idea. So I ended up actually training in management, and then a bunch of other things like BPR and lean and a whole lot of other stuff for that training company. So that's how I got into training.
And what came next?
Well, I think in hindsight, I was looking at what I was doing. I started doing training then independently in a number of areas. And also during that time, I'd been very interested in and had done quite a lot of training in things like NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and even got certified at board level for hypnosis and hypnotherapy and a bunch of other things like that. So I was really interested in how the mind worked. But probably from my engineering background, for me, it was an approach like it's a machine. How is it programmed? How does it work? And that same kind of engineering view on it was what I sort of took into that learning and development. And what that training company I was working for, who shall remain nameless because they're still in operation, what they were doing clearly wasn't working very well, because people were coming back on the same program or or I'd meet them later or talk to them later, and they said, well, it was fun, and, the blueberry cheesecake lunch was really good. There wasn't really that much impact going. And as an engineer, if I was designing machinery with a failure rate at that level, I'd be killing my customers. So I thought that's really not cool. So that was what I started to take into it, was a slightly different mindset, questioning mindset about, how does this work? What is its design? How can we make it do what the people who are using this want to do? And so on. So that's kind of got me on the whole journey of looking at L&D with a slightly jaundiced view, I think, back then, saying, well, hang on, there's something wrong here. What's wrong, and started noticing the elephants in the room and started looking at things differently. And that's when I started thinking, what can I do that will make a difference here?
Yeah, I think, we're well into this podcast now. We're well into our first series of these episodes. And one of the things we're finding, a bit of a golden thread, regardless of the background, in your case, obviously engineering, there is a real golden thread around curiosity. For people who've ended up in this space, freelancing in the L&D world, of just wanting to find out more and ask loads of questions. Why couldn't this be better? Why is it this way? Have we ever tried it a different way? And there's a real search for continuous improvement that I don't think exists in lots of other freelancing spaces. And I'm wondering, was there a point when you decided in those early stages of your freelance career, okay, this is it now. I am a freelancer. I'm going to give myself that label. I'm an independent consultant. Do you remember the day or the moment or the time when that kind of...
Not really. No, there was no decision to do that. It just kind of happened, and things carried on, and it's easy to drift with what's there. I do a weekly tip, and I have done for nearly 15 years now, on personal development and management and other things, and more recently also in L&D, and that goes out to thousands and thousands. If anybody wants to sign up for that, that's welcome to subscribe. But the one I did this week, strangely enough, was based on a Swedish proverb of, dead fish, float with the stream. In other words, they just drift with the current. And I think at that point I was probably drifting with the current. I wasn't swimming purposefully anywhere. I was just carrying on doing what sort of came next. And I think that happens to a lot of us in life. And so I just kept doing kind of what was in front of me. And one of the things that came back to me was when I was training independently of this other company, people were telling me, oh, I've been to lots of training courses, but the folder you gave me was the only one I keep on my desk on a day-to-day basis. So that got me aware that the way I was putting those materials and things together was perhaps useful, and I ended up developing a platform and a software product based around a large library of information. And ended up getting 120 plus authors involved with that process, and built that. That was the first software tool that I built. Although I did have some coding experience in the background, so that's kind of came out of a big eclectic mix of different skills and things.
Can we talk?
So that's when I got into the kind of the platform space and doing.
Yeah, what was that like then? That sort of making that decision to transition from it being about your time and your ability to come and run those courses and be with those people, to building something larger, like in your case, the platform.
I was also very conscious of selling time for money, and there's a limit to how much time you've got. And in a practical world, unless you're very lucky, there's a limit to how much you can charge for each hour and so on. So I was quite keen on the idea of earning something while I was asleep in bed, which is the old sort of thing that, you earn while you sleep. And so the idea of having something out there that was independent of my time. So that's kind of what drove it, I suppose. And that got me into the whole piece around learning and using performance support systems and all of that kind of stuff. And then into informal learning. What's all the learning that's happening outside of the normal, scheduled training and things like that. And that was the cornerstone of my first book on informal learning, was really at that point a bit of a treatise on, well, what is it? How can we leverage it? How can we use the power of it, quite frankly? Because most of what people learn to do their jobs and live their lives, they learn informally outside of any formal structure or training. The vast majority of it. I mean, regardless of the 70-20-10 model or anything like that, it's just common sense. I mean, we all know how to run a household, but we never did a training course on it. Or if you don't know how to run a household, you're probably married to someone that does. Otherwise, you'd be in kind of trouble.
Absolutely. I think about this a lot, about how this has kind of evolved over the years, the sort of informal learning and informal just-in-time style training. I'm famously awful with kind of practical jobs around the house. DIY, useless, absolutely useless. Tiling, not a chance. But if I needed to learn it, I wouldn't go on a course. I'd just look it up on YouTube and figure it out based on watching someone who does and allow them to train me. It sounds like you were quite ahead of that particular game of people deciding that that learning was going to be a pull rather than a push.
To a point, and I don't think our product did that as well as it could. I mean, that product's, is gone now. It's no longer available. We still have one or two customers on it, strangely enough. They renew every year, but we're no longer developing it or putting it out there for sale. But it's what got me into the whole idea of learning technology, tech stacks for learning, and thinking about learning in a different way and saying, well, hang on, is there some ways that we can do stuff with this? And then from there, if you want to continue the origin story, I got into the whole idea of, well, hang on, have we got the right people in the classroom at the right time learning the right stuff? Because that was an obvious problem where the wrong people were in the classroom at the wrong time and sometimes with the wrong stuff. So how do you do that whole, and that's what got me to this whole performance consultancy thing. And again, I kind of approached it as more as an engineer, looking at product, looking at a device or something. Like, how do we create that? What do the end users really want to do with it? How do they want it to work for them? And then working backwards from that. And that kind of, with that, I developed a whole, and building on the work of others too. That's not something I did on my own, but building, you stand on the shoulder to giants whenever you can. And I've built up a whole methodology around, doing that performance consultancy or diagnostics performance process. When someone says, I want some training, well, how do you answer that? And how do you do it in a way that you help them see what they really need rather than what it is they think they want? Because they're very often two different things. Clearly, if you deliver what they want and it's not what they need, whatever you deliver is going to fail, and then guess who gets it in the neck for that? So that was the next step, was that whole, and that book was Capability at Work. I wrote a whole book on it and I developed a methodology, and I still do workshops on that from time to time now. In fact, a big government department just yesterday was on a meeting and said, can you come and run a workshop with some of our people on the performance consultancy piece? So that was the next book and the next step in the journey of identifying stuff that wasn't working and trying to do something about it and getting it out there.
It sounds like there was lots of building going on during these phases. You were building your consulting business, you were building this concept of a platform with your engineering background, and then you were also writing these books alongside all of that as you were going through.
Yeah.
How did you decide how to apportion your time and your focus around all those different things?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think I look around me at all the plates I'm spinning and I realize that some of them are going to drop, and that's got to be okay. But what I've got to understand is which plates are fragile and which plates are made of plastic. Because some of the plates you're spinning are made of plastic, and if they drop right now, you can pick them up and start them spinning again later, and that's okay. If you task yourself with keeping every single plate spinning until it's ready to finish and take off, because the project's finished, you'll die an ugly, stressful death, I think.
Yeah.
So you've got to be aware of what you're spinning in terms of plates and which ones are plastic and which ones are fragile.
That's an awesome way of looking at it. I'm thinking about I know that a lot of people who listen to this podcast are relatively new in their freelancing journey, and they might be starting to feel some of the symptoms you're describing of spinning too many plates, kind of going with the flow a little bit based on what clients are asking them to do, and maybe not having the confidence to push back and really get into analyzing needs and figuring out what it is that's going to really make a difference and an impact. And also, you know, in that space of, well, maybe there are some reoccurring themes here that we can cover off with a product or a platform or a course, for example, that is evergreen, that people can keep on getting to, that is massively impacted by my time. I'm wondering about, should we start with the piece around with clients? Because you talked about this a second ago around really pushing back sometimes and saying, well, you told me what you need or what you think you need. I'm looking at this as an external thinking, oh, I'm not 100% sure that's right, or is it going to have a massive impact? How do you tend to navigate those conversations now?
I think that impact is the question. And actually, this was the next stage on my journey. I started looking at impact. If you do get the right people in the right room at the right time with the right content, how do you then make sure it actually gets operationalized and therefore has an impact? So whenever somebody says to you, I want some training, the response question, and I got this from a chap called Chris Taylor in the States, it's his question, is, do you want to just deliver some content here, or do you really want to make a change and make some impact? It's a very simple question. And the answer is pretty obvious. The person's always going to say, well, yeah, I want to make some impact. But you need to get that out loud and have them say it out loud, because then at any later point, and they start saying, oh, we want to add this content or add that content, you can say, hang on a minute, when we first started, we had an agreement that we were going to make an impact. And it was not just about delivering content. So let's focus on how we make an impact rather than these extra bits of curriculum you suddenly think you might want to have. Let's go back to the original brief. And that's what got me thinking that if you go through that performance diagnostics process or performance consultancy process, that from my second book, you end up getting a list of behaviors and things like that you want to come out of the program. Now, what you can do then is say, well, how do we deliver those behaviors now that we've defined the ones that we want, and provided we're correct and that that's the right set of behaviors to deliver on the organizational strategy and execute it? How do we make sure that if we do put them in a training room and teach them about those behaviors and even get them to practice skills and things that are related and so on, how do we make sure that actually transitions out there into the workplace and gets operationalized? So that's the learning transfer piece. And interestingly enough, I wrote a book on the whole thing about learning transfer. And I swore I'd never write another book, by the way, and I told people, hit me with something big and heavy. And I wrote a couple of articles and for magazines, and then I wrote a few more, and then I wrote an ebook on it, and then I finally said, oh, I got to write a book. And so I ended up writing a whole book on it. And in the back of the book, the back section, once over half of it, there's 166 tips on learning transfer, because I had all this information and I kind of got lazy, and I thought, well, I could turn all those tips or notes into prose, but the book would have gotten really big with lots of padding and all the rest to join all the dots. So I just kept them as tips and just put them out there. So it's a very practical, here's a little thing you can do, here's a little thing you can do. So people really love that, actually, and that has worked really well. But I started describing that as the elephant in the room, the training room. It's the thing that people acknowledge they should talk about impact and learning transfer, but actually they kind of ignore it because it's a bit difficult, don't know where to start. Or how can I sell this to the rest of the business? Because there's going to be a little bit of extra cost in doing these things on top of the cost of the course, and so on and so forth. There's lots in the book about how to handle all of that, by the way, but it's... And then I realized the other two books I wrote were also elephants, strangely enough. There's a whole bloody herd of them in the L&D room. And so learning transfer is one. The whole performance diagnostics up front is another. Not doing that right. And of course, informal learning, it's kind of like people ignore it and they think, well, we just do formal training, and they ignore the fact that a huge amount of what people learn to do their job happens outside of the remit of the training department or any trainers. It's people learn. They will. They always do. And you don't learn people. People learn if you put them in an environment or put them in a situation where that learning becomes easy. They will learn. They have to. We're learning machines. We'd have been consigned to the evolutionary dustbin a long time ago if it weren't for our ability to learn. So, yeah, I started talking about elephants. I think there's a fourth one, but I'm not going to write a fourth book. Three's enough for a trilogy.
Talk about that as a tool to grow a business, sort of writing a book. Because I think a lot of people listening to this, well, we have had guests on who have written one book. We've had a few guests on who are published authors. I don't think we've had anyone on who's written three. So I'm curious to know, first of all, would you advise that writing a book is a useful process for someone looking to grow a business like this, a freelance in L&D?
It's a very useful process, but I would also say not everyone has a book in them, despite what people, there's a common thing, everyone's got a book in them. Well, no, there's not that kind of sharp edge sticking out of your shirt, that there's a book there somewhere hiding, waiting to get out. It's quite a big process. It's something you've got to really want to do. You've got to be able to persevere with it when you don't feel like doing it. You've got to have some personal circumstances that will get you the time and the space to do that. It's a really good way to pull your ideas together and get it structured. You'll find the second's easier than the first. The third is easier than the first two, just because you're getting better at it. You know what you're doing. You know where you're going. You certainly get some help. I actually talk through with a lot of people who want to write books. I'm very happy to sort of talk through what I did and how I did it. We haven't got time here, but there's lots of little tips and things like that. But yeah, I'd recommend doing it. But make sure, A, you've got something that you feel needs to be said, and B, you've got an audience that you want to say it to. And yes, it can help with your marketing. Absolutely. As a book author, you end up getting some credibility and kudos that I think personally is a bit misplaced, because people think you've done all this work and this research. And yeah, you have, but you can do all that and not write a book. But you can do things like on the footer of your email, you can put author of the forthcoming book on XYZ. So you can actually claim authorship even before you've got the book published. Mind you, I wouldn't do that unless you're bloody sure you're going to get it published.
What a clever... I've never come across that before. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Because, so the fact that you're an author, people automatically give you a level of kudos and, credibility that... and then if you want, that can help you, go get speaking gigs and things like that. And then once you have the book, of course, it becomes a pretty cheap business card. You can get a copy of it and you can give it to people. As I give away a lot of my books at trade shows or at this or, trainings and all sorts of places. I've sold more than enough to cover all the costs and things. So I'm not trying to make money out of it, but it is a pretty powerful thing to say, well, I've got one of these. If you read books, would you like a copy? Then it gives you the excuse to follow up and say, hey, how did you get on? What ideas have you got? What questions you got? How could you use that in your organization? Can I come and help you do that? So.
Yeah, I often wonder if there was a kind of a superpower when it comes to freelancing, if there was one thing that would really shift the balance in your favor. And a lot of the time I keep coming back to that idea of being able to write, because it's one of those things that allows you access to lots of different platforms in lots of different ways, whether it's writing a book or being able to publish articles online or being able to write video scripts and be able to present like that, or being able to write something that other people might present on your behalf, marketing yourself on a website, marketing a product, a platform. I think if I was to go back and spend a lot of heavy time developing myself, I'd probably do more work around learning how to write good copy.
There's a bit of advice I got in my early days of going solo from someone. I was actually assisting them with some technical stuff, but he was a really top-end coach, coaching the financial segment in the City of London, and how do you manage your millionaires type of thing, with all these traders and so on. He was coaching there. And that was back in the days of Concorde. They'd actually fly him to New York on Concorde to coach the senior people there. So that's the level he was operating at. And he said to me once, every business is a marketing business. It's just that some of them, they have a product or a service to sell, but you've got to think of it as a marketing business. And so much of marketing is around copy and copywriting and writing stuff and establishing credibility. But the other piece to that puzzle is you've got to figure out what your value proposition is. And I think this is something I didn't do for a long time. I'm not saying I'm doing it well now, but I have a sense of my value and a sense of my audience for that value and how I can deliver it. So I think it's really important as a business, even as a freelancer, that what's your value proposition? What do you bring to the table that is going to cure a problem that someone else thinks they've got? Whether they've got it or not is almost irrelevant. It's their perception of they've got a problem. What can I bring to the table that will help them in a unique way that they would say, oh, I want to use that person as opposed to somebody else out of the yellow pages? So that value proposition is really critical.
Yeah. And I would also bolt on to that, it being also something that you're really deeply passionate and enthusiastic about, because I've met lots of people in this space who have come up with a really powerful value proposition and discovered over time that the more they do of it, the less they like the thing that they're able to fix or solve. But if it's something that you're genuinely inspired by and curious by and enthusiastic about, actually it makes the act of doing business and partnering with other customers a pleasure.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
And you can always tell. I think I meet so many people who talk about their work, and you can instantly see the energy kind of leave them.
Well, I mean, quite frankly, I use the word advisedly, but someone who's pimping themselves on something they don't believe in is a prostitute. You know.
And it's easy to do. I think especially when you're new in this space, kind of just saying yes to as many things as you can so that you can put food on the table and carry on paying the bills. Like you were saying, just going with the flow of what's coming at you as opposed to really stopping and thinking more strategically about what do I offer.
In the early days, unless you get given a golden parachute or you're in a position to choose, I think you have to. Quite apart from that, you'll start to learn what works for you and what doesn't. What sorts of customers will suit you and what, I will turn down customers now, but I never used to. And some customers I have now, I'm thinking, well, if it ever comes up where they just don't want to play, I'm fine to leave because they are hard work. I'll keep working with them for the moment. But so you just got to get a little selective. But I think that's a luxury that comes with time rather than something that, but a lot of that depends on your credibility and, how you get referrals from people. So it's based on how well you perform and all the rest of it. So you've got to do more than just marketing. You've got to follow that up with something that's solid. But again, that comes back to the value proposition. And part of that value proposition is your enthusiasm, quite frankly, because that's how you'll infect the client, for want of a better word, to get involved with that and actually do it on their end. Because whatever you do with a client, particularly in L&D, is always going to have to be collaborative. You can't do to the client's people. You've got to do it with the client's people and for the client. There's a big difference there.
We move on to have a look at your next era in the kind of evolution of your business when it comes to sort of going from consulting work, training work to, being an author and a speaker, and then building something that's larger. In your case, the learning workflow platform. What was that part like? How did you make the decision that you were going to go from here to here? Was it purely about being able to make money in your sleep, or what else was going on for you at that time? I think it was
an accident. Again, happier. I bumped into somebody who had some ideas. I still work with them, and they had the concept of a learning workflow. They didn't call it that, but they were doing things on paper that looked a bit like that in management training. And we got to talking, and I said to her, God, you should get that digital. And she said, I've been talking to various companies and e-learning people, and they keep getting it wrong. They don't understand what I'm doing. And I sort of said, okay, I think what you're doing is A, B, C, D. And she said, good God, how the hell do you know that? And I think it was because of my engineering background, because of my thing around informal learning, because of what I did. I was kind of getting where she was coming from. And why that was powerful. And I said, well, maybe I'll have a go at that. And so we started talking more seriously, and that's when I built the new platform, partly to host her stuff, but I also looked at the much bigger picture of how that could be a lot more flexible and do a lot of other things. And that's kind of where the whole learning workflow platform came out of. We still work with that person and with her pathways and workflows on our system. They still get sold, and they've been into some pretty amazing companies globally. with some of the stuff that she's done. But we also use it elsewhere in the NHS and so on for learning transfer stuff, for e-portfolio work. We've got people using it for apprenticeships. We've got all sorts of things on it, which is amazing, really. People keep thinking of new ways to use it just because of its flexibility. So it's kind of fun. It's really interesting. So that was the next stage, and then it was obviously build a tech team and get all that organised and get it out there as a product. And so the whole thing just kept building and building. But I've also done
building a team, because not many people I think who are in this space have yet got to that point in their in their journey. What was it like building a team for yourself?
Well, it was trying to getting people to do it. I chose to outsource, so we've outsourced to Eastern Europe, and that in the early days is purely from a cost perspective. There was no other way I could afford to do it, and I bootstrapped this myself rather than getting any financiers in to do it. So that's probably made the growth journey excruciatingly slow in a sense, but we've managed to do it, and we're still here and still growing, albeit slowly, So, but having said that, actually we're starting to speed up now because we've got over a certain kind of level of, what's needed to. So now, we're working, heavily into the NHS and other government departments and elsewhere. So it's kind of fun. But yeah, the first steps are certainly a bit daunting in that way of getting a team. And I certainly had some bad mishires and all sorts of things. There's stuff I did that were grossly wrong that cost a lot along the way. So get advice. I think that's always the thing. If
you were advising your past self around all of that, is there anything that you would have done majorly differently?
I think I would have probably got professional advice sooner. I would have sought out people that had done it before. I probably thought I was too clever and I could go and do it on my own. And this is obvious and simple, but it wasn't, and it isn't. And so I think getting involved with clubs, like Free Spirits, somewhere where there's other people who have some experiences different to your own, who can add some ideas. And that doesn't mean their ideas are right for you. It just means they're different ideas that can colour and help you broaden your thinking about what you're actually doing. Community you can ask questions of and so on. So I think that side of it's fairly important. The other thing right now, of course, in the last year or two, is you can go and ask AI some amazing questions on, I need to do this. How do I go about doing it? And any of the large language models will give you a huge range of answers to consider. I should be thinking about this or that, or, I want to develop a SaaS product to do this. What would be the first steps? What would be the next steps? What would be an overall project plan? It's incredible what you can do in terms of having an AI as a thinking or ideation partner.
I know one of my network members has instructed a custom GPT to act as his advisory board. So he runs his own business, his well-being business, and he's taught a series of characters from history. So there's like Seneca, and then there is Steve Jobs and a bunch of others kind of littered through history. And whenever he's got a big decision to take, he goes to his board, says, this is what I'm thinking about doing. This is what I think are the pros and the cons. Tell me your honest opinion. What should I do? Mm. So he ends up with like 7 different, very diverse and challenging opinions who often disagree with each other.
Yeah.
That help him just shape his thinking around all of these things. Incredible idea.
Yeah, yeah. There's a number of AI companies that do that kind of stuff already, that, out of the box almost. So, you can hire a set of pre-programmed interns that have specific skill sets. Yeah, that's a bit of the history, and now we're doing okay. So
it's incredible. I'd love to ask you a question which was posed by our previous guest, sure, who is also an author and a coach, Jude Slater, who is also originally from New Zealand.
All right. Okay.
And Jude's question was, Paul, how do you balance your working life with your life away from work? And kind of within that, what's your ideal life-work ratio?
Well, my life-work ratio is 100% life. and work's a part of that. So I'm never a great fan of this life-work balance, because work is a part of life. So I think the way you phrased it first is better. How do you mix and match and get a sense of how much time you put into work in your business, how much time you put into other things? So I think there's a coaching tool, that wheel with the spokes on it, where you rate yourself against your finances, your emotional health, your time, your family time, your whatever. But I think also it comes back to that spinning plates things. It's not a fixed ratio. There are some weeks or even months where you've got a lot of fragile plates and you've just got to pay attention to them. And then eventually you can take those off. They finish their time on the spinner. And then you can change your ratios again. So I think trying to be fixed about it can be a problem. But also you need to be disciplined enough that you don't just keep thinking every plate is fragile. That's the problem. So that's part of it. Also, I'm lucky I live here on a farm in Kent, so there's always stuff to do on the farm. In fact, this morning we were up walking the dogs near one of the big ponds, and there's a couple of trees in there. We're going to have to get the tractor and chains and pull the trees out. So, that's something a bit different to work. So I think having something that's very different to work, where you cannot think about work in any way, yanking a 2-ton tree out of a big pond with a tractor is not something you want to be thinking about the latest, customer problems or something. That's kind of how I'd answer that one. But I don't see work as separate to life. That's just part of what I do, who I am. Yeah, I'm having fun.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Did you want to leave a question for our next guest?
It's an interesting one. I was thinking, you said this was coming up, so I was thinking about it. And the question I actually came up with is, what is your golden rule?
Wonderful question. Thank you. Do you want to have a stab at that one for yourself? What's your golden rule, Paul?
That was also what I had to think about. How did I answer that? And I think for me, it's doing what I say I'm going to do. There are so many people that you send an email to or talk to or have a phone call with, I'll call you back on Tuesday, and they never do. And it annoys me, quite frankly, so I don't know. That's just, for me, that's a big thing, is honouring my promises to them. And I would rather hope that they respect me enough to honour their promises to me, to do a certain thing by a certain time or on a certain date or whatever. Interesting enough, whenever I'm working with people who are ex-military, I'm always saying, oh, God, thank God for that. They've been taught to do what they say they're going to do. So I often come across ex-military who are working in, there's one I'm working with right now in a hospital. He was a nurse in the military, and he's now a senior nurse in a hospital and one of our clients. And it's wonderful, because when he says he's going to do something, he does it. Or he resets the expectations, saying it ain't going to happen this week, sorry, buddy, but it will be by the end of next week. So he's setting expectations, so I'm not left wondering what the heck's going on.
I'd be interested in your take on this, Paul, this idea that as a society, we have got a bit more gentle, a bit more lenient when it comes to expectations and plans. I was thinking about this one in the context of when I was growing up. If I said I was going to meet some friends down the park or in town or to go and do something, we had no way of communicating with each other if plans had changed or we weren't sure about it. We just would have to turn up. Otherwise, they'd all be there and you wouldn't be. Whereas now, because we're in this age of kind of hyper communication and so many different forms of communication, that it's really easy just to check in with someone and say, oh, are we still okay for tonight? Are we still okay for that meeting? You're almost giving people excuses to not do those things, because there's so many possible ways to say, actually, no, I've got too much on today, or I've just had another competing meeting come up. Do you find this?
I don't know. I think you're probably right. I haven't tracked it. I don't really pay attention to it. I tend to live where I am now rather than in the past or in the future. I'm, focused on what's here and now. And of course, part of that too is, as an individual, you have a brand. And a brand is like a promise. That brand says, when you deal with this person, here are the kind of promises they make to the world about how they're going to be and how they're going to behave. That's really what a brand is it's a promise. And if you start, not fulfilling your promises, then of course your brand goes down the toilet and you get known as the person that doesn't do what they say or doesn't turn up on time or doesn't do this or doesn't do that. And that's not a very nice brand to have, quite frankly. And certainly if you're in business for yourself as a freelancer, that's a brand that you cannot afford to have, because people will just not ever go near you if that's your brand. So what brand do you want as a business, but also as an individual to deal with? And what's the brand promise?
Yeah, that's such an important point. I think a lot of people misunderstand credibility, that it's something that they own and they have total control over. And in a way you do. But I always think credibility is something that other people give you based on their perceptions of how you are with them, whether it's turning up on time for a meeting, whether it's what you wear, or whether it's how you speak, or how you conduct yourself in lots of different settings. All of those things give you kind of credibility points, and you have very little control over them other than being the person who turns up and choosing how you set that stall out.
Credibility is one way. Credibility is also something people give you, because people give me credibility because I've written several books in L&D and they've done pretty well. But that's different to my brand promise in terms of how I behave. So, and brand is different to reputation, although the two are closely linked. So credibility you can create up to a point by having a great website, by writing some books, by doing all sorts of things like that. And what's interesting is the word authenticity that often gets floated about. Is I've got a bugbear with that, because everybody is always authentic. How can you ever be not yourself at any point in time? You are who you are at that point in time. You're being, whatever you do is authentic to you at that point in time, with your current mood and everything else. Is when someone is accused of not being authentic, it's somebody else's view of them and saying, you're not fulfilling what I think is your brand promise, so therefore I'm going to label you as not authentic. So this lack of authenticity is a thing that is accused by others. It's not something you can do yourself ever, because you can only ever be yourself.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that, because I have the same bugbear with that phrase. It often gets used in the context of bringing your authentic self to work, and I've yet to find a company who genuinely believe that, even though they might plaster it all over their company values.
Well, you can't do anything else. That's all you can do.
Yeah. What they really mean is bring the best parts of yourself to work.
Yeah, that's what they mean.
And if you don't mind, just leave some of that really kind of messy personal stuff at home, please, because we don't really want to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I've got one more question for you, which is the question we ask all our guests, and that is, what do you charge?
For me personally, I typically charge out at $2,500 a day. If someone wants to hire me for a day for a workshop or something like that, then plus expenses. And if I've got to travel, I'll charge for that as well. So I have charged more in the past. I sometimes charge less. It just depends. If I'm charging out my staff, then there's a scale of rates depending on not so much who they are, but what work they're doing. But I'm also reluctant some ways to charge on a time basis, because that was what you asked. And I also find people will pay differently for a day's consultancy to a day's workshop, whereas you're doing more or less the same stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's interesting. They'll sometimes pay you a lot more for consultancy because that's something I think it's of greater value than they will for a training workshop, because they've got a set idea of how much a trainer should charge. So if you get your value proposition right, you should be talking value, in my opinion, rather than day rates. Now, sometimes I have to charge day rates out of my company to do certain stuff because that's how it is. Or if somebody's, like at the moment, we're working up a big specification for a custom bolt-on to our system. So we're going to have to figure out how long that's going to take us from a developer point of view and a project management point of view and all of that, and then figure out, well, how much is that going to cost us internally for that time, and then what margin do we have on it? And then I've got to think, well, actually, what value is that to the customer? And if they're going to get a huge level of value out of it, and that's on the table and they're aware of that, then I can pump the margin up a lot, because I'm actually providing value. And again, that guy I told you about who said every business is a marketing business, another thing he said to me is you are the worst judge of the value that you are providing as a coach to anybody. You don't know if or when they had their road to Damascus conversion. And I had a classic example of that where I was, back in the day, I did a bit of senior level coaching, and I was coaching a vice president of one of the big banks, and I was in at Canary Wharf, and we had a long session and it worked fine. And then he said, come on, that was great, I'll buy you lunch. So we went down and we had some fish and chips in the local kind of cafeteria. And a couple of months later, he said, the thing that made the biggest difference to me was a comment you made when we were eating fish and chips for lunch. Now, I was off the clock at that point, and I thought I'd done my best work. And yet the thing that actually made him change was something I said at lunch. And he subsequently got a promotion and so on. So for him, there was a huge amount of value in that. But it was a lunchtime comment, and I wasn't even thinking about it, really. I was just shooting the breeze, So you are the worst judge of the value that someone gets from you. So never try and judge your own value. You've got to help them help you understand the value that they are getting from what you are doing.
Gosh. Yeah, I really resonate with that. I had a conversation just yesterday with someone I'm working on as a collaborator for a series of workshops, and the bookings have been slow, shall we say, so far to pick up. And their initial reaction was, oh, should we just drop the price? It's got to be the price. And I said, actually, I don't think we should do that, because we're undervaluing our time automatically. No one's even booked on it yet, and we're saying it's worth less than we originally said it was. It's a natural reaction just to kind of undercut yourself. I've seen it happen in the proposal stage as well, where people go out and say, these are my prices, but if you book today, I can give you another 25% off that. And I always think that's a bit of an odd thing to do, because you're almost apologising for the value that you are about to add before you've even started working with them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the early bird offer is, it's a double-edged sword in that sense. Yeah, you've got cash in pocket, you've got some confirmed attendees, so there's an advantage in that. But if you do offer an early bird offer, what you should always do is explain why you're doing it and show that actually it's giving you value for the discount you're giving. In other words, there's a reason for the discount, this is what it is, and if you're transparent and clear about that, but if the reason is we just want to get numbers on the course, then that's not a good enough reason. So, yeah.
Thank you for that really comprehensive look into the way that you value your time and the way you price yourself. That's really helpful, Paul. My final question is, we've covered an awful lot about your background and all the different things that you offer. If people want to get in touch with you and find out more about what you do, how can they do that?
All right. Okay. Well, I'm easily findable on LinkedIn. I guess that's probably the easiest. But if they want to know more about what we do as a company, then peoplealchemy.com is the website for the software platform. And then there's also my personal website at paul-matthews.com. 2 T's in Matthews. Anybody with one is missing something important in their life, in my opinion. And there's a bunch of stuff on there and about my books and other bits and pieces like that. I'm always happy to have a chat. So find me on LinkedIn and just say, hey, I'm here. And, if you're thinking of writing a book, I'm very happy to have a brief chat about that with you and my experience and some of the things I learned along the way that would be helpful. Or if you're thinking about, learning transfer, or how do I do some stuff to my course to improve its impact? So how do we have that impact conversation with the client? That's a pretty big one for a lot of people in training, is they still think of themselves as a jobbing trainer. And quite frankly, there are so many jobbing trainers out there. It's a tough way to differentiate yourself. So how do you differentiate yourself?
It's really generous of you. Thank you very much, Paul. I'll make sure I add links to all of those in the show notes as the podcast goes out. In the meantime, I'm going to go off and examine all of my plates to see which ones are made of porcelain and which ones are plastic. That's been such a helpful
list
reflection.
Of them. And some of them will morph from plastic to China and back again, and that's okay too, but just be aware when they're changing.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great having you on the podcast.
Okay, brilliant.
If you enjoyed this episode, let us know by leaving a review on your favourite podcast app. It really makes a difference. And if you want to learn more about how L&D Free Spirits can lift up your freelancing business, you can find out more information at ldfreespirits.com.